Welcome to IJ Forums. I'm Dick Spotswood, politics and government columnist for the Marin Independent Journal. Today we're going to talk about the Point Reyes National Seashore. It is truly the last best place in America. About 50 years ago, the people of Marin and of America bought themselves a great present when Point Reyes Peninsula became a national seashore. The action happened because groups came together. The historic ranching families, a committed environmental community, and an aggressive Bay Area congressional delegation all got together and made something happen in Washington when Point Reyes became a national park. Today, the peninsula remains a treasure, but it's a treasure that's not without conflict. The issue of the continuation of the historic cattle and dairy ranches on the peninsula has again come to the forefront. The ranchers and their supporters believe that the dairy and cattle ranches are a part of the fabric of the peninsula that's been in existence for almost 150 years. They believe it adds to the quality of life of Marin and the entire region. Some in the environmental community believe that the time for ranching is coming to a close, and that a private use on public land is simply inappropriate, and that the ranchers inadvertently create environmental problems for both the peninsula and the community at large. As has become the American way, the decision on the future of Point Reyes will not be made by the people, will not be decided in the legislatures. It will probably be decided by a judge. Here with me on IJ Forums to discuss this now crucial issue are two people with great knowledge about the problems and the conditions on the Point Reyes Peninsula. Jeff Chanin is an attorney with the San Francisco-based law firm of Kecker and Van Nest. He represents the Resource Renewal Institute and the Center for Biological Diversity and the Western Watershed Projects in a lawsuit now filed in federal court based on, as he said, why the National Seashore needs a plan for how ranching fits into the park, not how the park fits into ranching. Jeff is a longtime resident of Marin, a supporter of the Marin Agricultural Land Trust, and loves eating grass-fed beef and local dairy products, as we all do, that he purchases every weekend from the Larkspur and Marin farmers markets. He also graduated from the University of Chicago Law School and has a bachelor's in history degree from Brown University in Providence, Rhode Island. Welcome, Jeff.
Thank you, Dick. Welcome, and thank you for having me here today and for this program.
Sam Dolcini is a Marin-based agricultural industry recruiter. Sam is a Marin native and also a member of the Marin Agricultural Land Trust. He is past chairman of that land trust and currently a board member of MALT. Sam is also currently the president of the Marin County Farm Bureau. Over the last 25 years, Sam has served on numerous committees on the county and state level that have dealt with a wide variety of agricultural issues. Sam also comes from a longtime West Marin ranching family and is currently involved in the family business. Jeff, Sam, welcome to IJ Forums.
Thank you for having me here.
Both of you. I'm going to start with Jeff. What's your vision? What's your client's vision of the Point Reyes Peninsula? What particular attributes do you think you want to see in 25 years out on that peninsula?
Wow. Okay, so 25 years takes us
What's your
to
vision?
about 2040. I think my client's vision, one which I would share, and I think most of the public would share, is that many years out, we still have a national seashore that has unimpaired habitat, natural resources, scenic beauty that's unaffected, hopefully, by climate change, where my children's children can go out there and enjoy it for its purposes, which is for public inspiration and to enjoy an undeveloped national seashore that really doesn't exist anywhere else in the country.
Sam, 25 years out.
25 years out, I'll be applying for Social Security, have time to be retired, and if I was to drive to the Point Reyes National Seashore at that point in my life, I hope to see a seashore that's very much as we see it today. This wonderful mix of wilderness and productivity area, and a seashore that honors the wishes, desires of the original founders and the community at large, which I think is a balance, and that will be respect and continue the tradition and the historic and cultural values of the agricultural operators and the pastoral zone and the wilderness attributes in the wilderness zone.
Sam and Jeff, and let's start this time with Sam. The current public discussion really centers around the future of ranching on the peninsula. To some, it's been a benign use. It's gone on for, 150 years? Something like that?
That's an accurate number, yes.
Okay. And for others, it's creates it's private use in a national park? I mean, a classic term is in holding, I think, in this situation. How do you see it?
I see it as both. Clearly, that area, all of Marin County, has been involved in active agriculture since the Spanish arrived here, and even before that, there's historical documentation of the Miwok Indians actively managing the lands that they were using. And you imagine there was probably a very large Native American population here. What a great place for them to have lived. Mild winters, abundant seafood, abundant wildlife, and so that tradition has continued. Also, the idea of active businesses on the national park is not something new or unique. When we look at Yosemite, we see the Yuwani Hotel and those types of enterprises. If you go to the Grand Canyon, the mules that pack people down in and out of the Grand Canyon are enterprises. And so I think that we need to just continue that model and that concept and that idea.
Jeff?
So this is the kind of debate, actually, that should be taking place, but it has to be taking place in the right way, at the right place. And really, there's a misconception about what this lawsuit's about.
Tell us.
Okay, sure. Well,
That's why you're here.
many people think that the lawsuit is about cows versus no cows, benign use versus adverse impacts, and that the lawsuit is going to make that decision. It's not. It's not. The lawsuit is about the process that we have in the United States and out here in the national park system for figuring out how to make those decisions. And what happened in this case, and what this lawsuit is about, is that the National Park Service, by law, every unit of the National Park Service is mandated to do an update to a general management plan that looks at all of the uses of the park, pros and cons, visitation, ag, wildlife, natural resources, in keeping with the purposes of a national park, and look at how conditions have changed and come up with a comprehensive plan for the next 15 to 20 years, which also requires an environmental impact statement, a report, and an assessment of what's happening. Conditions have changed in this park since the last GMP, the last General Management Plan, which was in 1980. And even at that point in time, when ranching was established and leases had been granted for 20 years or more, they didn't do an environmental impact statement. So it's never been done with respect to ranching. What is dairy operations, what are dairy operations and beef cattle doing to the Point Reyes National Seashore, to the habitat, to the endangered species, to the natural environment? What the lawsuit seeks is that the Park Service do what it was supposed to do, and it began to do in 2000. Between 2000 and 2008, they gave notice that they were going to update the General Management Plan and do an EIS, which they needed to do, and spent 8 years conducting research studies, evaluating what the environmental impacts were of visitation, climate change, and that was on the cusp of being issued to the public, a draft general management plan for public debate, this kind of discussion about pros and cons, what do we want from a national park, what are its purposes, when it was quietly put to the side. And here we are in 2016, and we're still waiting. And what happened, I think, was the oyster farm battle began, and pressures came on to put that to the side. And instead, years later, in 2014, a ranch management plan they gave notice of that, and that has as its objective that ranching will be continued for another 20 years. It's a stated objective. And so instead of looking at the place of ranching in the park, some of which may be fine, maybe none of it is fine, reduction may be fine, there were alternatives that were being considered which looked at those concepts, and we're going to open them up to public input, and that is not happening now. And so what the lawsuit seeks is an order that the Park Service follow its legal mandate required by several different acts and by the National Environmental Protection Act to do an environmental impact assessment of ranching and look at the comprehensive uses of the park before completing a ranch management plan and issuing new 20-year leases.
It would probably be naive to think that each party in this debate, if there's two sides, and probably multiple sides, don't have an end game. And the question I have for you, and I'm going to ask this in response to Sam, is what's wrong with the cows out there now? What's the problem? For an East Marinite to drive out there, it looks terrific.
Yeah.
And there's a great culture out there. And, I'm an environmentalist. Most Marinites are environmentalists, but it doesn't seem incompatible. Tell us what's wrong with the cows.
Sure. Well, I'm not an expert on
no,
cattle, nor do I need to be,
Yeah,
because
yeah.
the National Park Service itself has had some studies done already that suggest that there may be a serious problem.
Tell us.
Okay, what's wrong with the cows? First, cow manure. Tough topic, but it's a real one. Cow manure is a major contributor to greenhouse gases. And climate change, the park itself has a policy to try to reduce emissions in the park. It's part of a network of parks that want to be climate friendly. They have an initiative to reduce emissions by 45% by this year. That was the initiative in 2008. It hasn't happened. And the largest contributor to greenhouse gases out at Point Reyes is manure from cattle. It contributes 78% of all emissions. That includes all the transportation. So that's number one. It's a threat to climate change, and it's contributing to it, and the park itself is threatened. Second, by the way, just to give you a sense of the emissions from that, because we can all say what we want, but the study that the park conducted is that there were 12,500 metric tons of CO2 released by manure, as compared to a typical family home, which emits about 12. So it's about 1,000 times more.
But if you move those 12, how many cows?
I think there's about 6,000 cows.
If you move those 6,000 cows across the road to the other side of the highway where there's no national seashore,
Yeah.
they're still going to emit the same amount of methane.
Well, they won't be doing it at a national
No,
park.
but it'll still go in with climate change. It won't affect climate change.
It depends where those cows go, I guess, but you're right. It won't affect climate change if they're moved someplace else.
Yeah, I'm just saying,
But in a national park, we have a policy. I mean, the park has a policy that it's not going to contribute to emissions. That's not what the public wants. But it's something to be debated.
Sure.
Other harms are soil erosion, and harms to the that's been a ton of it. Cows also contaminate the water supply, and they threaten endangered species as well. And there's a competition now, as you know, between Tule elk and cattle.
Oh, yeah.
And while, Sam, you talk about history since the Spanish arrived, well, before the Spanish arrived, there were Tule elk. And it's interesting, the Park Service itself has, reintegrated them because they were rendered almost extinct after the gold rush by hunting and by cattle foraging. And it ruined their forage area, and they were almost extinct. So now they're back, and they're beautiful. But during 2013, 2014, over 200 Tule elk died from drought and thirst, and because they were confined to an area. And so there's a battle between the two. And I just want to show
Before
you.
you do, I'm going
sure.
to take a break. We'll do those after the break. But I just want to ask Sam before.
Yes, certainly.
Methane, erosion, pollution on the creek, real problems, mitigatable problems.
I'm not even sure they're real problems. If they are problems, they're definitely mitigatable. And we live in California. There's no secret. There are lots of people that are watching all industry in California, especially agriculture. And there's a lot of attention and a lot of agencies that are directed to address these very topics. Whether it's water quality, soil erosion, there's phenomenal amounts of work have occurred with organizations, government agencies, to work on trying to ameliorate these problems. So I don't think they're necessarily as large as we're being led to believe when you look at the big picture.
Figuring out how to handle these is a really interesting question. We're going to take a break for just a second, and we're going to come back to those. And then, Jeff, I want to see those photographs you have.
Sure.
It's a beautiful bucolic setting out here in Point Reyes, and of course that's one of the reasons that the environmental battles have become so heated out here in the Point Reyes National Seashore. Hi, I'm Robert Sterling, editor of the Marin IJ, and I want to invite you to read more about the cattle ranching issue and other environmental issues at our website, marinij.com. Thank you for watching IJ Forums.
Welcome back to IJ Forums. I'm Dick Spotswood. With me today are Jeff Chanin, who's an attorney for a group of environmental organizations that are challenging the process of looking at ranching in the future of the Point Reyes Peninsula, and Sam Delsini, who's the past president of the Marin County, past president or current president?
Current president.
Current president of Marin County Farm Bureau. And before the break, I was asking Sam a bit about Jeff's statement of the negative impacts that he sees with the dairy and cattle ranchers.
Sure.
Methane gas, land erosion, and I guess poop in the stream, if you will. I don't know.
I'm glad you readdressed those topics, and I'm happy to touch on those. As you mentioned, if those cows aren't there, where are those cows? They will be somewhere else. They will be managed somewhere else. The Point Reyes Peninsula is world renowned for its pastoral zone, its soil, its climate. It is as cow friendly as you can get. It seems like no better place to have dairies than somewhere that's very similar to where the cows evolved on the islands off of England. To the question of methane, agriculture, like any other business, any other society, is always evolving. One of the things that we have seen improvements made on are methane digesters, which can take methane off a storage facility, turn it into gas, convert that gas into electricity. It burns very cleanly. For an agriculturalist to make that kind of an investment, though, he needs to have security that he's going to be there for a certain period of time. And this is where this entire project that is going to lead to the question and hopefully renewal of long-term leases will make it possible for ranchers to make those kinds of investments, something they're afraid to do now. As far as any other ideas that were brought up, there are numerous federal agencies that are already policing those kinds of activities. We saw that Drake's Bay Oyster was able to sell a product right out of Drake's Bay Estero that was in water that were consumed by humans. That water must have a certain high water quality if that was possible. So I'm not sure that I can buy into all of the thoughts that are going into this massive damage that's being done. And we have to realize that anything that goes on in a national park has an impact. As a youngster, I used to go camping out there, and we'd go to the wilderness areas, but we'd still find picnic tables and restrooms and barbecue pits, all part of, yes, there's an impact, but there's also an overall goal for that part of the park. I'd also like just to briefly touch on the Thule elk that were mentioned. Oh, yeah. It's kind of interesting that while agriculture is frowned upon as being part of the downside of the elk that were repopulated for the state of California were found on a ranch owned by the Miller and Lux Company in Southern California. Yeah. So it was an agriculturalist that kept that last set of elk together. And it gives me concern when you hear about the massive die-off on Point Reyes or on Pierce Point in the national park. For generations, that part of the Point Reyes National Seashore was an active cattle ranch. Ranchers figured out how to keep their livestock alive there for over 100 years. It's interesting that the National Park Service wasn't able to do the same thing with the elk that they had responsibility for.
Jeff, I asked you before about some of the negative impacts that you believe that the cattle ranching and the dairy ranching might occur on the Point Reyes Peninsula. And I know you've brought with you some photographs you'd like to show our viewers today that might demonstrate, at least illustrate, I think.
Right, I do, and but I just want to bring us back to the point that the kind of discussion that we're having here about whether cattle ranching, commercial cattle ranching, dairy operations are appropriate in a national park that's owned by the public is the real issue, and how much of it, if so. And that's the issue that's supposed to be resolved in a general management planning process. That's what's not happening. The ranch management plan process that's happening now assumes the end result, which is that the ranching is here to stay, and that's what the local National Park Service rep said. Ranching is here to stay at Point Reyes for another 20 years. That decision should not be made without the kind of scientific input and public input that looks at the purposes of a national park. This is not a West Marin Park. It's not a Marin Park. I happen to live here, but it's not a Marin Park. It's not a California park. It's a national park, and it gets 2 million visitors a year. Those visitors' purposes in coming to the park and the very purposes of a national seashore have to be considered. And I'll tell you that when you look at the purposes of it, from the enabling legislation, from the start and all through, it was not agricultural. It's for the public to enjoy the scenery and inspiration of a national seashore that's undeveloped. And so whether ranching has a place in that, dairy or cattle grazing, and they're different.
Oh, yes.
Right? So you want to see the pictures of what a dairy operation
Before you do,
like.
I'm going to take advantage of your question there, because you brought up the I think, which is, for the lawsuit's point of view, what it's all about is a procedural question.
That's right.
So before you show the pictures, I'm going to ask Sam if he thinks that the procedure is proper now. Sam, is the procedure proper now? In other words, what Jeff's saying, I think the crux of the lawsuit is that there should be an EIR. They should look at the entire situation before they come to a specific conclusion.
Right,
correct?
absolutely.
Okay. Is he right? And I know you're not an attorney, but I'm not really looking from an attorney's point of view. I'm looking at it from a right and wrong point of view.
And I appreciate the fact you point out, I'm very impressed with Jeff's education. Well, on the level of education, I just barely got out of a state school. So, and no, I'm not a lawyer. So
I am a lawyer, and don't be impressed by lawyers' backgrounds. So just-
We just know the law.
there we
That's
go.
all we know.
Sometimes.
Yes.
And maybe a little
Yes.
bit of history too.
Yes, and I think we're on the same page when we talk about process. And to give you perspective, you are representing 3 organizations that are suing the National Park Service. And I would say that the agricultural community is trying to be an active participant in the process that the National Park Service is working their way through. I don't have the background, nor have I done the research to be able to comment on where the process is or if it is being handled correctly. What I can tell you is that I have went to those scoping meetings and have been to numerous hearings where we put poster boards up and everyone had their ideas, and there were lots of ideas in the room. The agricultural community was there. People that you represent were there. I had conversations with some of them. Some of them were good conversations, and I enjoyed learning their perspectives. So at least from the agricultural perspective that has not even in the park, there is progress. We think there's progress being made, and we want to see the process done correctly.
Well, that's great.
Yeah, so
But now
here's
we've
the
just reached
difference.
a settlement
Sure.
here. Like,
Well, here's the difference. The general management planning process was considering 5 different alternatives that related to ranching, whereas the ranch management plan assumes there's going to be 20-year leases granted. Under the general management plan that was supposed to be released at the end of 2008 and was nearing completion, these different concepts were that there should be potentially leave things as they are, a reduction of the amount of or type of ranching to preserve the scenic environment. Another focus was on how much ranching might be reduced in order to assure that we're not impairing endangered species and other critical habitat. So those are the kinds of considerations that a general management plan will look at, as well as the purpose of a national park. People come to the national park not to look at dairy farms, but to look at the national seashore. Now, if the public wants to say, we love it, we love what we're seeing, that's fine, but let's take a look at it. Because let's take a look at it. Okay. You've asked me before.
Yeah.
I mean,
And briefly, by the way. on
Sure,
this.
sure. No. Here's one of the dairy operations that you see when you're there. That's not exactly, pastoral cows on an open field. Here's another one as you're looking out at the seashore. Holding up for the public to see. Is that what we want when we talk about scenery at a national park? Here's kind of what happens when the cattle are out feeding and going back and forth to that dairy farm. You can see what it looks like. That's not. I mean, maybe we have to live with that elsewhere as a price of having beef and dairy. But not necessarily at a national park. So that's the kind of discussion.
I'm wondering if I'm going to have a chance to at least respond and give some perspectives to these
Sure,
pictures.
sure,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Well, sure, but
But let's-
you know,
because we have a
it's
limited
just,
time, I
you
do
know,
want to give
yeah,
Sam a
just
chance
one
to-
more when we talk about like soil erosion.
There-
This is kind of the soil erosion that takes place when cattle are moving back and forth. So I'm not going to say to you that this isn't acceptable. That's what the general management planning process needs to decide. People, the public, should be entitled to give input into that before it is a done deal. And where we're headed right now and why the lawsuit is filed is because the Park Service has decided it's a done deal and has said so. And now they are pursuing a ranch management plan with the objective to grant new 20-year leases without ever doing that environmental impact statement.
Sam.
I didn't realize that pictures were going to be an option today, nor would I have time to prepare. But I could also have brought in pictures of parking lots that are overcrowded, of lines of traffic going in and out of the park, all part of using the park and impacts that come with it. The thing that's interesting, or the thing that I would make a point out with, when you look at those ranches, you see, old farmsteads and old buildings that have been there for over 100 years. They're part of the cultural and historical value of that national park. And you talk about, and you mentioned that park belongs to everybody, and it does. And the exciting thing is that those enterprises provide jobs for people that not only live there, but employment for people that provide the inputs, and on the other side, food that shows up in places like Clover Sternetta, Strauss Creamery, the farmers market. So there's a societal benefit, not only environmentally, but economically as well. And the other thing that's been pointed out a couple times, it's come up that, you know, there's concern about endangered species, which we're all concerned about. But there's as much evidence that there are some species that do better with productive active wildlife or with active agriculture than not. In some of those pictures, there are areas where cattle are excluded, and you see a great abundance of brush that is developed behind them. It's interesting that when they tried to locate elk into the wilderness area, they came back to the pastoral zone. So those elk must be making a comment about the current management practices and how some of them are beneficial to wildlife.
I'm going to ask a personal question to both of you. It's a historical question, really.
Sure.
I vaguely recall, I was around in those days, and when the Seashore was created, there was a great huzzah. Everybody was, I mean, there was universal around here happiness. And the reaction of an awful lot of people, I can tell you that the people I talked to about it and reflected back on it, was that the huzzah was the great last place, this wonderful peninsula will be preserved as it is. And to a certain extent, some of us interpreted that to mean the ranches would be there, and some interpreted it to mean that it would be a park, a pristine park, a typical national park. Briefly, Sam,
Yes.
Jeff, what was promised in the old days to the public? A park with no private uses, or a park with some private uses in the form of ranching? I mean, I'm just trying to find out what was promised.
Sure.
What's your impression?
My impression is the spirit of the law was a park that would have both wilderness and a pastoral zone with active agriculture and enterprises operating in it, as you see in other national parks around the United States.
Jeff?
So I don't know what the spirit of the law means, but the law is clear. The enabling legislation gave the Secretary of the Interior authority to buy ranch lands and make them public lands, subject to the most effective means of preserving the seashore's purposes and purposes of the Act in accordance with that. And the Secretary made a determination to buy at fair market value, and the ranchers didn't have to sell, and gave them a reservation, a use reservation that was to last for 25 years or the later to die of the owner or the owner's spouse. That has expired. So there, whatever, you know, that reservation idea, which was a fine concept, sell your land for fair market value and get another 25 years plus your lifetime, that's expired. So that, we're talking about the future. Now in 1978, a public law, that law was amended, and that's when that happened. So now we're in 2016. So there are no promises anymore. It's about discretion at this point. The Secretary of the Interior, the Park Service, has discretion to continue a commercial operation like this if it's in keeping with the purposes of the Act.
We're going to have to wind down, but I'm always tested between the question of the procedural nature of the lawsuit and the big picture of the lawsuit. The public looks at both.
Sure.
Law looks at one thing, the public looks at the other thing, and hopefully we come together. And the ideal is that the environment's preserved in a pristine manner and the ranching family and the history sustains. Whether that's possible, we'll have to find out in a long time. It's been a pleasure to have Sam Dulcini of the Marin County Farm Bureau and Jeff Chaitin, a distinguished attorney representing 3 environmental groups on the Point Reyes Peninsula issue on the future of ranching, right here on IJ Forums. There'll be more in your independent journal coming up over the next year on this topic. I'm Dick Spotswood, politics and government columnist for the Marin Independent Journal. Thanks for watching IJ Forums.